in view of the complexity and fragile balance of life, of this chemistry of life, I like to think that if one is the result of a evolutionary process, then the thesis of that random reorganization of the genetic material is no more convincing than an orchestrated genetic reorganization. Whether this orchestration is the result of the divine or of unknown scientific laws, my stand is not to dismiss one or the other, but to show that given our current scientific understanding, evolution is closer to belief than to an empirically proven scientific law. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. So we're coming at the end of the book, in the conclusion. But before going to the conclusion, I would like to go through the appendix on evolution. Why? Because evolution is maybe one of the most delicate and controversial topic of our time. For many, it represents the decisive argument for choosing religion or atheism or scientism. Indeed, through the theory of evolution, mankind is for the first time in history capable of explaining, even if not completely, for our presence on Earth solely using material arguments without resorting to any divine intervention. So consequently, people have used this theory of evolution as an argument to adopt a purely materialistic vision of the world. As God is no longer needed in their views, they have classified religion itself as an evolutionary relic and an outdated vision of the world. However, I already showed that the physical explanation of a phenomena does not negate its divine nature. They're like the two faces of the same coin. You can explain it scientifically, but it doesn't negate that it has a spiritual aspect within it, attached to it, inherent to it. I further argue that the theories of evolution and creation from an Islamic point of view are not necessarily contradictory. In this aim, I'll first review the scientific position, its development, strengths, and weaknesses, and then I'll review the religious text relating to the creation of man to finally show that the Islamic vision of creation has much more in common with the theory of evolution than it is commonly perceived. In other words, I suggest that the Islamic story of human creation can, if one wants, be read in light of the theory of evolution. I'm not saying that it is the best reading, I'm saying that it is a possible reading. If it is possible, then if one wants to stick with evolution, that does not become an argument or reason why he should leave faith aside. So starting with the supporting evidences, scientific evidences for evolution, I admit that every time I walk into a paleontological museum, I'm quite amazed by the similarities between morphologies throughout the vast majority of the animal kingdom. Whether it's the skull, the rib cage, the limbs, everything from the snake to the turtle passing by the whale, the similarities are undeniable. Did you know, for example, that the turtle's shell is simply an extension of its vertebrae? The paleontological register is in fact the expression of a common genetic base. It turns out that all known living organisms share a genetic code, the DNA, that are made of the same nucleic acid, like the same letter of that alphabet. And that alphabet works according to a certain process, the same process across the living beings, whether it's replication, transcription, translation. So it is that genetic similarity between species that are used to draw phylogenic trees, the diagram that shows species deriving from one another. And as a matter of fact, it turns out that a good number of proteins, of protein complexes, are shared between all animals and even plants. Like ATP synthase, for example, the protein complex that create ATP, the universal biological energy currency. So this protein, ATP, is used to transport energy stored in a chemical form from one end of the body to the other. As such, it is a universal energy currency. It is produced, as I said, by a biological power plant called ATP synthase, a molecular 3-stroke rotary engine. It turns out that every living organism has a counterpart of that ATP synthase, that 3-stroke engine. With such similarities between the most varied species, it would be an act of bad faith to not imagine a relation between all living organisms. Consequently, I would say it's intuitive to imagine a common origin. So I would say it's an appealing theory of evolution, but it's still incomplete. Even though you can see similarities, that is not necessarily sufficient for establishing the existence of kingship between species. So to give an example, if you look at diamonds and you see two different diamonds, the structure is the same. They are similar, but they originate from drastically different places. They can originate from even a different part of the world. Their similarities then stems from similar conditions, but they do not necessitate kingship, a link between them. One does not emerge from the other. It might be a crude example, but it's just a crude example to show that similarities do not necessitate common origin. Common process, maybe, but not necessarily common origin. But with this being said, to refuse imagining common origin, it's still preposterous. So regarding the theory of evolution as it is taught in schools, life would have started with a spontaneous assembly of organic matter into what we call primordial soup, a mixture of organic material. So we've found amino acids in meteorites, like you can have chemistry in space, where reactions takes place and you can create small and slightly more complex organic molecules. And you can imagine that during the accretion of the Earth, these meteorites break apart, liberate the organic load, that this organic material then mixed with melted ice, so water, agglomerate and get concentrated in a type of primordial soup. To this you add heat and, as I said, humidity and other properties of our Earth at early stage, and you can have a context that favors the production of even more complex organic material through Fischer-Tropsch types of reactions. So in other words, so the idea is pretty simple, is to take many, let's say, Lego bricks that come from space. They end up together and you shake them well enough in a specific pattern. And after a while, you can hope to have your Lego model emerging from it. That's what the theory alludes to. So you can say that, yeah, the probability of such a thing happening is negligible. But the scientists will say, or the atheist scientist will say, yeah, but give it a few million years, and it will take place. So yes, it might be extremely simplistic, but the probability remains. The limitation of that assumption is that given our current understanding of physics, chemistry, thermodynamics, etc., it is not likely. It is quite impossible. but the possibility remains. So the theory itself is based on the assumption that with enough time, with favorable conditions, life will necessarily appear somewhere, somehow. So in terms of probability, everything is possible. And even throwing a dice that does not stop on one of the faces, but in balance on one of the vertices, it should be possible. Highly unlikely, yes, but possible. Give it a few million throw, and you can hope to maybe see one occurrence. Another more likely hypothesis, however, is to accept that what we know of the world is limited. That maybe life has emerged through that process, yes, of accretion and amalgamation of organic material, and then reorganization of that organic material through physicochemical forces and interactions that are still unknown. It is possible. But in either case, whether this original cell or colony is the result of a sequence of highly improbable events or of unknown processes, it amounts to belief. It is a belief. Because we don't have any direct proof. We were not there when it took place. So after the creation of an original organism or colonies of organisms, the theory of evolution suggests that a species arises from a previous one as a result of genetic mutations. However, we have never witnessed a genetic rearrangement such that it allows the appearance of a new species. That claim is now debated because there are studies that can show speciation, that alludes to speciation. But these studies oftentimes have to take into account whole colonies. So you're not looking at individuals, you're looking at an ensemble. And to look at an ensemble, you need statistics. So these conclusions are based on statistical models. Again, they are based on a theory. No theory is perfect. So again, it is debated. There's no clear-cut argument for one or the other. So there are indeed a growing number of interesting studies on bacterial population that can be used to support some sort of evolution through species and even speciation. However, these studies, given the large number of bacteria involved in each colony, are based on statistical models, and the data is interpreted by default in terms of evolutionary biology. So in other words, it is equivalent to assuming the truth of a theory that is to be proven. The conclusions are inherently biased. So I mean that when you do such an experiment in the lab on a bacterial colony, you will interpret it by default in terms of evolution. And the result will either corroborate, agree more or less with the current theory of evolution. It will never be used to entirely dismiss evolution, but just to support it more or less. Maybe it will ask for refinement, but rarely for whole dismissal. So the conclusions are inherently biased. But beyond the biased rules upon which this field of evolutionary biology is based, it is the definition of key terms that is still required. While looking for speciation, the definition of a species is itself debatable. Like how much different must one individual be from the subsequent generation? Or how much different must the subsequent generation be with respect to the original generation in order to be considered a new species? And surely, depending on the chosen definition, yes, the fossil record as well as the bacterial colonies in the lab can either be devoid or filled with intermediary species that support speciation. So one may also argue that in order to be valid, the theory must be falsifiable, which refers to this ability to be proven wrong. In the case of evolution, however, this condition cannot be fulfilled, as the theory pertains to speciation events that are expected to have already taken place a long, long time ago. And therefore, it's not expected to be witnessed in natural conditions during a single lifetime. Similarly, while studying speciation, we are not really looking at the emergence of a single new species, but at a statistical change or pattern, oftentimes across hundreds of different species. Accordingly, the conclusions are model dependent, and if the data persistently resist to be fitted by the model, it is only the model that will be discarded, but not the underlying theory. The only way to disprove this theory of evolution, if one wanted to do so, is to witness speciation events that do not involve any known genetic process, such as what we would call a miracle, like a spontaneous appearance of a new species. In other words, in order to prove or disprove evolution, given the current state of knowledge, one has to either travel back in time and witness 1,000, if not 1,000,000 years of subsequent genetic modifications, or witness some sort of spontaneous speciation. In either case, a miracle is necessary. Interestingly, modern scientific theories do not seem to be restricted by this falsifiability principle. On the contrary, to strictly apply the falsifiability principle would render scientific endeavor impossible, as no theory ever fully explain all the data available, including relativity, including quantum mechanics. So the falsifiability principle is useful to choose between competing theories. But to this day, evolution does not have any other scientific alternatives. So with respect to the process of speciation via random genetic mutation, from what we've been witnessing so far in complex organisms, none has yet resulted in tangible results. So it is true that genetically modified organisms, GMOs, can make a plant or animal more resistant to certain environmental factor, or force them to express one of their traits disproportionately, like size, growth rate, etc. But it's often at the expense of other characteristics. Like you have a nice strawberry, but it won't taste much. It will look good, but not smell good. The nutrition will be low. So actually, of all the molecules that I had the chance to study myself in the lab, it turns out that none had a unique function. For example, a chlorophyll molecule what makes the plant green? It's the chlorophyll. That chlorophyll molecule can be used as an antennae to absorb light, like in light harvesting complexes, sometimes used as a gateway to block the passages of another molecule, like in the cytochrome B6F, sometimes used to accept or supply an electron, or even to liberate a high energy electron, like in reaction centers. So the same chlorophyll molecule plays a different role depending on the context in which it is placed. So modifying the expression of a single constituent within an organism therefore amounts to changing the context in which other molecules perform. And in turn, the function of these other molecules are likely to be altered. In view of the complexity and fragile balance of life, of this chemistry of life, I like to think that if one is the result of a evolutionary process, as described above, just using random mutations, then the thesis of that random reorganization of the genetic material is no more convincing than an orchestrated genetic reorganization. Whether this orchestration is the result of the divine or of unknown scientific laws, my stand is not to dismiss one or the other, but to show that given our current scientific understanding, evolution is closer to belief than to an empirically proven scientific or empirically demonstrated scientific law. So I'll stop here about the scientific understanding of evolution. وجزاك الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.